I drove 16 hours straight through a blinding rainstorm just to make it to my sister's engagement dinner in the Hamptons. When she finally opened the door of the massive oceanfront mansion, she stood there in a pristine white silk dress clutching a crystal glass of champagne. She looked my soaked clothes up and down with absolute disgust. She laughed and said we had the dinner yesterday. She told me Julian only wanted core family and people of his social caliber in attendance. My own mother stepped up behind her and told me to go back to my car because my working-class appearance was embarrassing the wealthy groom's family. I did not scream and I did not cry. I simply smiled and walked away. 2 days later, my sister called me in a screaming panic because the black card she tried to use for a $150,000 wedding deposit was publicly declined. I smiled into the phone and said I forgot to mention the card is only for core family. My name is Sienna and I am 32 years old. If you have ever been treated like a stepping stone by your own family, only to be tossed aside when they think they have found someone better, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe because you are going to want to hear exactly how I dismantled their fake luxury empire brick by brick without shedding a single tear. I parked at the end of the driveway and took a deep breath. My clothes were wrinkled from the 16-hour journey, and my hair was damp from a quick stop at a gas station, but my heart was full of genuine happiness for my sister. I grabbed the expensive engagement gift I had bought for her and stepped out into the freezing rain. The cold wind whipped against my face as I walked up the wide stone steps leading to the towering oak front door. I pressed the brass doorbell and waited. I could hear faint music and the clinking of glasses coming from inside. Warm yellow light spilled through the large windows. After a few moments, the heavy door clicked and swung inward. Aaliyah stood in the doorway. She looked like she had stepped out of a bridal magazine. Her flawless skin glowed and her hair was styled in an elegant updo. She wore a stunning white silk dress that hugged her perfectly. I recognized the designer immediately because I had paid the $5,000 credit card bill for it just last week. She held a glass of expensive champagne in one hand. But the moment her eyes landed on me, the bright smile on her face completely vanished. It was replaced by a look of sheer panic and intense irritation. She did not invite me inside. She just stood there blocking the entrance. I smiled and told her I finally made it through the storm. She looked over her shoulder nervously before glaring back at me. She asked me what I was doing here. Her tone was sharp and completely devoid of any warmth. I felt a knot form in my stomach, but I ignored it. I told her I was here for the engagement dinner. Aaliyah let out a short, mocking laugh. She took a sip of her champagne and leaned against the doorframe. She said we had the dinner yesterday, Sienna. She told me Julian and his parents decided it was best to keep the gathering intimate. She looked at my damp clothes and wrinkled jacket with absolute contempt. She said they only wanted core family and people who understand how to behave in high society. The words hit me harder than the freezing rain. Core family. I was her sister. I had paid her rent for the last 3 years. I had funded her entire lifestyle while she pretended to be a successful entrepreneur on social media. Before I could process the insult, another figure appeared in the doorway. It was our mother, Brenda. My mother was wearing a tailored silver gown and a diamond necklace. When she saw me standing on the porch, her face contorted with annoyance. She stepped past Aaliyah and crossed her arms. She did not ask about my long drive or if I was hungry. She looked at me like I was a delivery driver who had come to the wrong address. She told me I needed to leave right now. She lowered her voice to a harsh whisper and said the Davenport family is very wealthy. She told me my working-class vibe was going to ruin Aaliyah's chances. I stood there on the front porch with the rain soaking through my jacket and chilling me to the bone. For the first time, I saw them for exactly who they were. They did not love me. They only loved what my bank account could do for them. I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of clarity. I simply nodded my head and smiled. I told them I understood completely. I turned my back on them. I walked down the stone steps and back out into the pouring rain. I heard the heavy oak door slam shut behind me, locking me out into the freezing cold. I reached my car, unlocked the door, and slid into the driver's seat. I took my phone out of my pocket and looked at my banking app. I saw the massive credit limits I had extended to them out of blind familial loyalty. They thought they could humiliate me and discard me without facing any consequences. But they had made a fatal miscalculation. They had forgotten that I was the one holding all the strings. I started the car engine and turned the heater on. The 16-hour drive back to Atlanta was going to give me plenty of time to orchestrate their absolute and total financial ruin. The rain lashed against the windshield of my car as I pulled out of the massive driveway of the Hamptons estate. The tires hummed against the wet asphalt, and with every mile that passed between me and that towering oak door, the heavy fog of familial obligation began to lift from my mind. For my entire life, I had been the workhorse of the family. I was the one who studied late into the night, who worked 3 jobs during college, and who built a wealth management firm from the ground up. But in my mother's eyes, no amount of success would ever make me equal to Aaliyah. Aaliyah was the golden child. She was the beautiful one, the charismatic one, the one who was destined for high society. I was simply the bank that funded her destiny. As I navigated the dark coastal roads, my mind replayed the last 5 years of our family dynamic. Aaliyah had built a massive following on social media by portraying herself as a young, self-made millionaire. Her feed was filled with pictures of her wearing designer clothes, staying in luxury resorts, and dining at exclusive restaurants. Her followers praised her business acumen and her flawless aesthetic. But the truth was, she had never worked a day in her life. Every single silk dress, every first-class flight, and every expensive meal was paid for by me. I had always justified it by telling myself that family takes care of family. When my mother came to me crying 2 years ago saying she needed help with living expenses, I handed her an American Express Centurion Black Card. It was supposed to be for emergencies and basic needs, but slowly the charges morphed from groceries and medical bills to luxury boutiques and 5-star hotels. My mother was funneling my money directly to Aaliyah to build her fake empire. And then came Julian Davenport. Julian was the ultimate prize in my mother's eyes. He was a white man from an old money family in the Hamptons. When Aaliyah started dating him, my mother treated it like a royal engagement. She constantly reminded me that Aaliyah was elevating the family name and that I needed to do my part to support her. Doing my part meant paying the rent on Aaliyah's luxury penthouse so she could pretend she owned it. It meant buying the $5,000 engagement dress she wore tonight. It meant staying hidden in the shadows so my working-class vibe would not ruin the illusion she had created for the Davenports. They genuinely believed I was just a desperate woman craving their approval. They thought I would always keep the money flowing because I was terrified of losing my family. They were wrong. I pressed the voice command button on my steering wheel. The Bluetooth system chimed softly in the quiet cabin of the car. I told the system to call my private wealth concierge at American Express. The phone rang twice before a polite voice answered. The representative greeted me by name and asked how he could assist me this evening. My voice was completely steady and entirely devoid of emotion. I told him I needed to immediately freeze the Centurion card ending in 4821. The representative paused for a moment and asked if the card had been lost or stolen. I looked at the dark highway stretching out in front of me and smiled. I told him no, it was not lost, but I suspected fraudulent activity and unauthorized use by the secondary cardholder. I instructed him to decline any and all future transactions immediately and to place a hard lock on the account so it could not be bypassed. The representative typed quickly on his keyboard, and within seconds, he confirmed that the card was entirely locked down. He asked if I wanted to issue a replacement card to the secondary user. I told him absolutely not, and instructed him to cancel the secondary access permanently. I ended the call, and the cabin returned to silence. The cutoff had begun. It was a simple 5-minute phone call, but it was the equivalent of cutting the oxygen line to their fake luxury life. They had spent the last 2 days living in a fantasy world, drinking expensive champagne and rubbing elbows with high society all on my dime. They had looked down their noses at me while standing in a dress I bought with money I earned. The satisfaction that washed over me was intoxicating. I did not feel an ounce of guilt. I thought about what would happen next. I knew exactly how Aaliyah operated. She was reckless with money because she never had to earn it. The Davenports expected a lavish wedding, and Aaliyah had promised them the event of the century. She was completely reliant on that black card to pay the vendors, the caterers, and the venues. Without it, she was nothing but a fraud in a borrowed dress. As I crossed the state line, the storm finally broke, and the sky began to clear. The long drive gave me hours to meticulously plan my next steps. Freezing the card was only the beginning. I was not just going to stop paying for her life. I was going to let the weight of her own lies crush her. Julian and his wealthy parents thought they were marrying into a successful business empire. Aaliyah had sold them a massive lie, and my mother had co-signed it. They had built a house of cards on top of my bank account, and I had just pulled out the foundation. I turned up the radio and let the smooth jazz fill the car. My mind was razor sharp. I mapped out the exact financial structure of the company and how I would systematically dismantle any claim they thought they had over my assets. I thought about the apartment lease in Atlanta that was in my name. I thought about the car she drove. I was going to take it all back piece by piece. They wanted me to be an outsider. They wanted me to be completely separate from their core family. I decided to grant them their wish. They were about to learn how cold and unforgiving the real world is when you do not have someone else paying the bills. I kept my hand steady on the steering wheel and drove through the night, heading back to my city, my company, and my money. 2 days had passed since the miserable drive back from the Hamptons. It was a bright Tuesday morning in Atlanta, and the sunlight was pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office. I was sitting behind a massive mahogany desk on the top floor of the building that housed Apex Lifestyle and Wealth Management. I was the CEO and founder of this firm. I had built this company from nothing, turning it into a premier agency that managed the assets of athletes, tech founders, and real estate moguls. The environment was completely under my control. The air was cool, and the faint hum of the city traffic below provided a steady rhythm to my morning. I was wearing a tailored navy blue suit and taking slow sips of my black coffee while reviewing a quarterly portfolio report for a new client. Life was peaceful when I was not dealing with my family. At exactly 10:15, my personal cell phone began to vibrate aggressively against the smooth glass surface of my desk. The screen lit up and flashed my sister's name. I stared at it for a few seconds. I took another sip of my coffee and let it ring. It stopped, and then immediately started vibrating again. I finally reached out and dragged my finger across the screen to answer the call. I brought the phone to my ear, but I did not even have the chance to say hello. "Sienna! What the hell is going on?" Aaliyah screamed into the phone. Her voice was trembling with a mixture of absolute rage and sheer panic. The sound was so loud I had to pull the phone an inch away from my ear. I could hear the frantic echoing of her footsteps and the hushed murmurs of other people in the background. It sounded like she was hiding in a bathroom stall. I leaned back in my leather executive chair and set my coffee mug down on a marble coaster. I asked her calmly what she was talking about. She was hyperventilating. She told me she was currently standing inside the grand lobby of the Glass Pavilion. The Glass Pavilion was the most exclusive and outrageously expensive event venue in New York State. It was a stunning architectural masterpiece with transparent walls suspended over a private lake. It was a place where celebrities and actual billionaires got married. She said she was there with Julian and his mother to finalize the booking for the wedding. She had confidently walked up to the event director and handed over the Black Centurion card to cover the $150,000 deposit. But the card machine flashed red. The payment was declined. She told me the event director smiled politely and tried to swipe it a second time. It was declined again. He then tried to manually type the 16-digit card number into the system while Julian and his mother watched from a few feet away. It was declined for a third time. Aaliyah's voice cracked as she described the crushing humiliation of standing in front of the wealthy Davenport family while a piece of plastic loudly rejected her. She had excused herself to the restroom, pretending she needed to make a quick call to her banking assistant to clear up a routine fraud alert. She demanded to know why the bank had shut off her access. She ordered me to call my wealth manager immediately and fix the error before Julian realized what was happening. She said she needed the hold lifted right this second because she could not walk back out into that lobby empty-handed. I listened to her frantic breathing for a long moment. The silence stretched through the phone line. I looked out the window at the busy Atlanta streets below. My pulse was completely steady. There was absolutely no anger in my voice, just a cold and unyielding truth. I told her it was not a bank error. I told her I was the one who canceled the card. There was a dead silence on the other end of the line. The realization hit her like a physical blow. And then the explosion came. She asked me if I was completely insane. She asked how I could do this to her on the most important day of her life. She screamed that Julian was going to think she was broke. She said the Davenport family would cancel the wedding immediately if she could not secure the glass pavilion. She ordered me to turn the card back on right now, or she would have our mother fly down to Atlanta and destroy my life. I let her finish her entire tantrum. I listened to every threat and every insult. When she finally ran out of breath, I leaned forward and spoke directly into the phone. I told her the Centurion card was an extension of my personal wealth. I reminded her of the conversation we had on the front porch of the Hamptons estate just 2 nights ago while I was standing in the freezing rain. I repeated her own words back to her slowly and deliberately so she could absorb every single syllable. I said, "You told me the engagement dinner was only for core family. You told me I was an outsider who did not know how to behave in high society. You and Mother made it very clear that my working-class vibe was an embarrassment to the Davenport family." I paused for a second to let the memory wash over her. I told her it simply does not make sense for an outsider to fund a high-society wedding. I told her the card is only for core family now. Aaliyah let out a sound that was half gasp and half sob. The reality of the situation was finally breaking through her delusions. She started pleading and threatening at the exact same time. She said I was just a jealous, bitter woman. She said I was trying to ruin her happiness because no wealthy man like Julian would ever look twice at someone like me. She told me to stop being petty and to authorize the charge right now because her future mother-in-law was waiting in the lobby judging her. She said if I did not fix this, she would tell everyone that I was just a low-level employee who stole money from her business accounts. I smiled at the sheer audacity of her empty threats. She had lived inside her own lies for so long that she actually believed she had power over me. She still believed she was the CEO of my company in the eyes of her fake world. I told her she was more than welcome to tell the Davenports whatever she liked. I suggested that since the Davenport family was so incredibly wealthy and traditional, she should just walk back out to the lobby and ask Julian to pay the $150,000. I told her it was the perfect opportunity for her upper-class fiancé to step up and provide for his bride. I wished her the best of luck with the wedding planning. I ended the call before she could scream another word. I placed the phone face down on the polished mahogany wood. The financial lifeblood was severed and the panic had officially begun. My phone laid silent on the desk for exactly 45 seconds before it started vibrating again. The screen flashed with my sister's name, but this time, I knew she was not the one holding the device. I let it ring until the final second before dragging my finger across the glass and bringing it back to my ear. "Listen to me very carefully, you little pencil pusher." The voice on the other end was male. It was deep and dripping with the kind of unearned arrogance that only came from a lifetime of extreme privilege. It was Julian Davenport. I sat perfectly still and listened. "I do not know what kind of sibling rivalry you think gives you the right to play games with company funds." Julian continued, his tone sharp and condescending. "But let me remind you of your place, Sienna. You are an employee. Aaliyah is the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Lifestyle and Wealth Management. She is your boss. She is the owner of the firm that puts food on your table. The words hung in the air of my quiet office. Suddenly, every strange comment from the engagement dinner made perfect sense. The puzzle pieces snapped into place. Aaliyah had not just exaggerated her income. She had entirely stolen my professional identity. She had looked Julian and his wealthy parents in the eye and told them that she was the brilliant self-made founder of my wealth management firm. She had reduced me, the actual CEO and founder, to a lowly financial assistant that she kept on payroll out of pity. I took a slow breath, letting the magnitude of her lie wash over me. "Are you listening to me?" Julian barked, his patience wearing thin. "My mother is standing in the lobby of the glass pavilion right now watching my fiancé cry because her incompetent sister forgot to file the proper authorization paperwork with the bank. This is deeply embarrassing for the Davenport family. We do not do business this way." He spoke with the absolute certainty of a man who believed the world existed solely to serve him. He leaned heavily into his fake old money persona, using phrases like proper authorization and doing business as if he were closing a massive corporate merger instead of throwing a tantrum over a declined credit card. I remained completely silent, letting his frustration build. My silence only made him angrier. "Let me make this very clear for you, Sienna," he said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "I know Aaliyah hired you because your mother begged her to give you a job. I know you have a chip on your shoulder because your younger sister is more successful than you. But if you do not call American Express right now and authorize the $150,000 charge, I will personally make sure you are terminated before the end of the business day." He actually thought he was intimidating me. He thought his white privilege and his family name were enough to bully a working-class black woman into submission. He thought I was terrified of losing my meager salary. "I will have my family lawyers contact the board of directors," Julian threatened, blindly unaware that I was the sole owner. And there was no board of directors. "You will be blacklisted in the financial sector in Atlanta. You will be back to working retail before the wedding even happens. So go into the system, unfreeze the account, and do your job." The sheer audacity of his demands was almost comical. Julian Davenport, a man who was allegedly sitting on a massive family fortune, was currently bullying his fiancée's supposed assistant to pay for his own wedding venue. If his family was so incredibly rich, why was he so panicked about my sister's credit card? A truly wealthy man would have simply handed the event director his own card and handled the deposit himself to save his bride the embarrassment. But Julian did not do that. He snatched the phone to threaten me instead. That was the moment a tiny seed of doubt planted itself in my mind. Something about Julian's aggressive desperation did not align with the billionaire heir persona he projected. I finally spoke. My voice was smooth and completely devoid of the fear he expected to hear. "I hear you, Julian," I said softly. "Good," he snapped. "Fix it." I did not tell him the truth. I did not scream that I was the CEO. I did not tell him that Aaliyah was a fraud who did not own a single share of stock in my company. Correcting him would have ended the game too early. It would have given them time to do damage control. I wanted them to feel safe. I wanted them to continue building their massive house of cards so the crash would be absolute. "I will make sure the accounts are handled exactly the way they deserve to be handled." "Julian," I replied, my words carefully chosen. "Tell Aaliyah, I hope she gets exactly what she is worth." Before he could demand clarification, I moved the phone from my ear and tapped the red end call button. I tossed the phone onto the desk and leaned back in my leather chair. Aaliyah had sold him a massive lie, and Julian was arrogant enough to believe it. They were a perfect match. Two toxic people pretending to be royalty. But Aaliyah had made a fatal mistake by giving him the name of my company. She had brought Apex into her web of lies, and nobody messes with my company. I turned toward my computer monitors and woke up the screens. The financial lifeblood was cut, but now it was time to go on the offensive. I needed to know exactly who Julian Davenport was. I needed to know why an old Money Hamptons heir was sweating over a venue deposit. I opened my secure corporate email network and began typing a message to the head of my financial intelligence and private investigation team. I told my lead investigator that I needed a full background check on the entire Davenport family. I wanted their credit history, their real estate holdings, their business portfolios, and their tax records. Working in high-level wealth management meant I had access to the best forensic accountants and private investigators in the country. We routinely vetted multi-million-dollar acquisitions and screened potential partners for our elite clients. Digging up the financial footprint of one arrogant man and his parents in New York would take my team less than 48 hours. I pressed send on the email and watched it disappear into cyberspace. My sister thought she was so smart. She thought she could use my money to buy her way into a powerful family and leave me behind in the dirt. But she was playing checkers while I was playing chess. She had handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy her. By lying to the Davenports about owning my company, she had committed a massive fraud. And Julian, by threatening me, had shown his true colors. I picked up my coffee mug and took a long, slow sip. The coffee had gone cold, but I did not care. I felt a surge of adrenaline coursing through my veins. The panic at the glass pavilion was just a small taste of what was coming. They had locked me out of the house in the freezing rain, but I was about to lock them out of their entire fake reality. The next morning began like any other Wednesday. I was in the middle of a secure conference call with a client in Tokyo when a sudden commotion outside my office caught my attention. Through the soundproof glass walls, I saw my executive assistant standing up from her desk, trying frantically to block the path of a woman who was marching down the hallway. The woman was wearing a wide-brimmed hat and carrying a designer bag that I had paid for. It was my mother. She had actually flown all the way down from New York to Atlanta just to ambush me at my own company. Before my assistant could call for backup, the heavy glass door to my executive office was violently shoved open. My mother stormed in her face, twisted in a mask of absolute fury. She did not care that she was interrupting a professional business environment. She did not care that several of my high-level employees were staring through the glass in shock. She only cared about one thing, and that was protecting the fake reality of her golden child. I politely told my client I needed to pause the call, and I took off my headset. My mother marched right up to my mahogany desk and slammed her hands down hard on the polished wood. She leaned over and screamed at me, asking what the hell was wrong with me. She said I had deeply humiliated our family in front of the Davenports, and that Aaliyah had spent the entire night crying in her hotel room because the venue had canceled her reservation. I just sat there in my leather chair looking up at the woman who gave birth to me. I saw no maternal warmth in her eyes. I only saw a desperate panic that her daughter's ticket to high society was slipping away. I kept my voice perfectly level. I asked her if she enjoyed her flight down here on my dime, since she had undoubtedly used my frequent flyer miles to book the last-minute first-class ticket. That simple question pushed her right over the edge. She reached into her expensive designer bag and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. She threw them aggressively onto my desk, scattering the crisp white papers all over my keyboard. She told me to stop acting like a smart aleck. She pointed a trembling finger at the documents and demanded that I look at them. She told me it was an unconditional trust fund release. She said she had stayed up all night paying a shady lawyer a premium fee to draft it. The document was designed to legally transfer $2 million of my personal corporate assets into an irrevocable trust that would be controlled entirely by Aaliyah. My mother stood up straight and tried to use the one weapon she had always used to control me, which was her authority as my parent. She told me I owed this money to my sister. She said I had been blessed with a cold and calculating brain for business, while Aaliyah had a gentle and creative soul that needed to be nurtured. She said it was my duty as the older sister to provide for the family and to ensure that Aaliyah could marry into the Davenport dynasty without any more embarrassing financial hiccups. She leaned in closer and lowered her voice to a vicious whisper. She said if I did not sign those papers right now, she would publicly disown me. She threatened to tell our entire extended family and our church community that I was a greedy, heartless woman who tried to sabotage her own sister's wedding out of pure jealousy. She thought the threat of being cast out of the family would break me because it had always worked when I was a child. I picked up the top sheet of paper and scanned the ridiculous legal jargon. It was a pathetic and desperate attempt at corporate extortion. I looked back up at her and asked her if she really thought I was stupid enough to sign away $2 million just because she threw a temper tantrum in my office. I told her the bank was permanently closed and the family ATM was officially out of service. Her face turned a deep shade of crimson. She lost complete control of her senses. She raised her right hand high into the air and swung it down with all her might, aiming a vicious slap directly at my face. I did not even flinch. I simply leaned my chair back, letting her hand slice through the empty air mere inches from my nose. The aggressive momentum threw her off balance, and she stumbled forward, hitting her hip hard against the edge of the heavy desk. Before she could recover her posture, I reached over and pressed the silver button on my office intercom. My voice was icy and steady as it echoed through the outer office speakers. I told the front desk to send 2 security guards up to the executive suite immediately to remove a hostile trespasser. My mother gasped in pure shock. She grabbed the edge of the desk to steady herself. She could not believe I had just called security on my own flesh and blood. She started screaming that I was a monster and an ungrateful child who was going to burn in hell for disrespecting my mother. Within seconds, 2 large security guards in dark professional suits entered my office. They assessed the situation instantly and politely, but firmly grabbed my mother by the arms. She thrashed against them, kicking her expensive heels and shouting wild curses at me. She screamed that I was nothing without her, and that Julian was going to hire real lawyers to destroy my little business. She yelled that they would take everything I owned and give it to Aaliyah. I just sat there and watched her in complete silence as the guards dragged her out of my office. She fought them the entire way down the glass hallway, her screams echoing off the corporate walls for all my staff to hear. They forced her into the elevator, and the stainless steel doors finally slid shut, cutting off her frantic threats. My executive assistant tentatively stepped into my office and asked if she needed to call the police. I looked down at the absurd trust fund release papers still scattered across my keyboard. I calmly swept the entire stack into the trash can next to my feet. I told my assistant I was perfectly fine and that she could go back to her desk. I put my headset back on and resumed my call with Tokyo. The mother who had raised me to be a disposable stepping stone was officially gone. She had tried to use force to take my empire, but all she did was give me the final push I needed to destroy hers. I finished the conference call with Tokyo with the exact same professional tone I always used. My client never suspected that less than 5 minutes ago, my own mother had tried to physically assault me in my office. When the screen finally went black, I took off my headset and laid it gently on the desk. The room was entirely silent again, but the echoes of my mother's vicious screams still lingered in the air. My mother calling me a monster. My mother demanding I hand over $2 million to secure my sister's future. I closed my eyes and let my head rest against the high back of my leather chair. The physical threat did not scare me, but the sheer entitlement in her voice unlocked a door in my memory that I had kept tightly shut for 14 years. I was 18 years old again. I was standing at the counter of a local bank branch clutching a crumpled deposit slip in my hand. The smell of grease and strong coffee from the diner was still clinging to my uniform. I had just finished working a double shift, and my feet were aching, but I was so incredibly happy. I was ready to deposit my cash tips into my college savings account. I had spent 4 years scrubbing floors, taking extra shifts, and missing out on every single high school dance just to save enough money to pay for my freshman year at a state university. I handed the teller my account number and asked for a balance check. When the bank teller handed me the printed receipt, my heart completely stopped. I thought there was a printing mistake. The balance was zero. The teller looked at me with pity in her eyes and told me that the joint account holder had withdrawn the entire balance in a single cashier's check 2 days prior. I remember running the whole way home in the sweltering Atlanta heat. My chest was heaving and the panic was choking me. When I burst through the front door, my lungs burning and my eyes filled with tears, I did not find my mother in a panic. I thought maybe there was a medical emergency or a sudden death. Instead, I found her standing in the driveway with her arms wrapped tightly around Aaliyah. Parked right in front of them was a brand new luxury sedan with a giant red ribbon on the hood. Aaliyah was jumping up and down, screaming with joy while holding a shiny set of keys. I walked up to my mother and held out the bank receipt. My hands were shaking violently. I asked her where my money was. She did not even look guilty. She did not apologize. She looked at me with the exact same expression of annoyance she wore today in my office. She sighed and adjusted her cardigan as if I was interrupting a beautiful moment. She told me she had to withdraw the funds because Aaliyah was starting her junior year at an elite private school. She said Aaliyah absolutely needed a reliable and expensive car to fit in with her wealthy new classmates so she would not be bullied. I stood there paralyzed. I told my mother that money was for my college tuition. I told her I needed it to start classes in exactly 2 weeks. My mother just rolled her eyes and turned back to admire the shiny paint on the car. She told me I was smart and capable. She said I could easily figure it out and take out student loans like everyone else. She said Aaliyah was delicate and needed the family support more than I did because she was destined for high society. I remember standing in that hot driveway realizing for the very first time that my blood, sweat, and tears were nothing more than a slush fund for my sister's vanity. I was not a daughter to them. I was just a resource to be harvested. I opened my eyes and the bitter memory faded back into the shadows of my pristine glass office. I was no longer that helpless 18-year-old girl standing in a driveway with an empty bank account and a broken heart. I was a 32-year-old self-made millionaire sitting in a corporate tower I built with my own 2 hands. I did not shed a single tear today. The betrayal did not break me, just like it did not break me 14 years ago. It only forged my spine into solid steel. My mother thought she could storm into my life and bully me into submission because she still saw me as that quiet teenager who would just swallow her pain and figure it out. She thought the dynamic had never changed. She thought the scapegoat would always bow down to the golden child. I reached over to the intercom button on my desk and pressed it. My assistant answered immediately, her voice still slightly shaken from the earlier commotion with security. I told her I needed her to contact our chief legal counsel immediately. I instructed her to pull the top 3 aggressive corporate litigators we had on retainer and assemble them in the main conference room by 2 o'clock. My assistant paused for a second before confirming the order. She knew that when I called that specific legal team together, it meant someone was about to be utterly destroyed in a court of law. I told her to pull every single financial record connecting my personal corporate accounts to my mother and sister spanning the last 5 years. I wanted every wire transfer, every credit card statement, and every fake rent payment printed and bound into individual folders. I stood up from my desk and walked over to the floor, to ceiling window looking out over the sprawling Atlanta skyline. The Davenport family thought they were dealing with a frightened little employee who had stolen from her boss. Julian thought he could use his fake old money influence to try and bury me with legal threats. My mother thought she could use emotional blackmail to force me into signing away my wealth. They were all marching blindly toward a brutal war they could not possibly win. I smoothed the wrinkles out of my tailored navy blue suit jacket. The days of being the family scapegoat were officially over. I was not going to hide in the shadows anymore. I was not going to quietly cut them off and let them fade away. They wanted to play games with contracts and lawyers and high society rules. I was going to give them exactly what they asked for, but I was going to play the game by my rules. I walked out of my office and headed toward the conference room. The legal team was waiting, and it was time to prepare the battlefield. The heavy glass doors of the main conference room slid open silently as I walked in. My three senior corporate litigators were already seated around the long, polished granite table. They were the sharpest legal minds in Atlanta, and they were paid handsomely to protect my empire. My assistant had already placed the thick binders of financial history at each of their seats. Before I could even sit down and begin the briefing, my assistant knocked softly on the glass and stepped into the room. She was holding a thick, cream-colored envelope that had just been delivered by a private courier. She said it was marked urgent and highly confidential. I took the envelope from her and sliced it open with a silver letter opener. I pulled out a thick stack of high-quality watermarked paper. The letterhead belonged to a boutique law firm located in a wealthy zip code of New York. It was a formal cease and desist order directed at me. The sender was listed as Julian Davenport, and his parents acting as the legal advocates for Aaliyah. I stood at the head of the table and began reading the letter out loud to my legal team. The document was a masterpiece of unearned arrogance. The language was incredibly patronizing, clearly written by someone who assumed I was just a rogue administrative assistant who did not understand basic corporate law. The letter formally accused me of embezzling company assets and unlawfully restricting the rightful chief executive officer from accessing her personal and corporate funds. It demanded that I immediately restore all credit card privileges to Aaliyah and transfer a sum of $500,000 to the Davenport Family Trust as a show of good faith and compensation for emotional distress. The letter ended with a blatant threat. It stated that if I did not comply within 24 hours, the Davenport family would use their extensive resources and powerful connections to press criminal charges against me. They promised to ensure that I would serve federal prison time for wire fraud and corporate theft. They honestly believed that dropping a few heavy legal terms would terrify a black woman into surrendering her life savings. They thought their white privilege was a magic wand that could instantly erase my reality. When I finished reading the final paragraph, a profound silence fell over the conference room, and then I started to laugh. It was not a nervous laugh. It was a genuine deep belly laugh that echoed off the glass walls. Within seconds, my three senior litigators joined in. The room filled with the sound of top-tier lawyers chuckling at the sheer absurdity of the document. The head of my legal team, a brilliant man who had taken down massive pharmaceutical companies, wiped a tear from his eyes. He asked me if they really just threatened the sole owner of Apex Lifestyle and Wealth Management with corporate theft of her own company. I nodded and tossed the cream-colored papers onto the center of the granite table. My lead attorney leaned forward and said he could draft a response in 10 minutes that would have that New York law firm begging for mercy. He said we could easily prove ownership and countersue the Davenports for harassment and attempted extortion. It was the standard legal protocol to squash a nuisance like this immediately. But I held up my hand to stop him. I did not want a standard legal response. A standard response would end the game too quickly. It would simply inform them that I was the true owner, and they would retreat and hide behind their supposed wealth. I did not just want to defend my territory. I wanted to salt the earth so nothing they ever planted would grow again. I looked at the letter sitting on the table and tilted my head. I pointed out a very crucial detail to my team. I told them to look at the letterhead again. The law firm that sent this was a small boutique agency that primarily handled minor real estate disputes. It was not a powerhouse corporate litigation firm. If the Davenport family was truly as wealthy and powerful as they claimed to be, they would have elite lawyers on retainer just like I did. They would not be using a strip mall attorney to send a poorly researched cease and desist letter to a major financial institution. Moreover, the demand for $500,000 to be deposited directly into their family trust as compensation was completely bizarre. Wealthy people do not extort employees for quick cash injections. Desperate people do. I told my legal team to hold off on sending any response to the New York lawyers. I instructed them to let the 24-hour deadline expire in absolute silence. I wanted the Davenport family to sweat. I wanted them to sit in their Hamptons estate and wonder why their terrifying legal threat was being met with total indifference. Instead of fighting them in a courtroom, I chose to attack the root of their arrogance. The entire foundation of their power rested on the illusion of their old money fortune. Aaliyah was attracted to Julian because of his supposed wealth, and Julian was attracted to Aaliyah because of the fake empire she built with my money. It was a fragile ecosystem of lies. I pressed the button on the conference room phone and called down to my financial intelligence unit. My lead investigator answered on the first ring. I asked him for a status update on the background check I had requested earlier regarding the Davenport family. He told me they were already pulling the public tax records and digging into the shell companies connected to Julian's father. He said they were finding some very interesting discrepancies and promised a full dossier on my desk by the following morning. I ended the call and looked back at my legal team. I told them we were not going to stop at proving my ownership of Apex. I told them we were going to completely dismantle the Davenport family name. They had invited themselves into my business and threatened my freedom simply because they thought they were inherently better than me. They thought the law was a weapon designed exclusively for them to use against people like me. I was going to teach them a devastating lesson about what real power looked like. The trap was set, and I was perfectly content to wait for the morning to see exactly what kind of rats we had caught. The next morning arrived with a heavy gray overcast sky that mirrored my cold and calculated mood. I walked into the lobby of Apex Lifestyle and Wealth Management at exactly 7 a.m. The building was mostly empty, but my financial intelligence unit was already buzzing with activity on the secure sublevel floor. I bypassed my executive suite entirely and took the private elevator straight down to the intelligence department. When the metal doors slid open, I stepped into a room filled with glowing monitors and the soft hum of high-powered servers. This was the true heart of my empire. Managing wealth for the elite required more than just picking good stocks. It required knowing every single dark secret, every hidden debt, and every offshore shell company our clients and their rivals possessed. I paid my lead investigator heavily because he was a former forensic accountant for the federal government and he knew exactly how to track ghosts through the global financial system. He was sitting at his large, curved desk, rubbing his tired eyes when I walked up. The screen in front of him was filled with cascading lines of raw financial data. I pulled up a chair and sat next to him, asking what he had found so far. He took a sip of his black coffee and looked at me with a bewildered expression. He said, "Sienna, you asked me to look into an old money family, but the data I am pulling does not make any sense at all." He began to bring up different screens showing the public and private records of the Davenport family. He started with the basics. Julian Davenport and his parents supposedly owned a sprawling estate in the Hamptons, multiple luxury vehicles, and claimed to have a massive generational trust fund. But when my investigator dug past the shiny surface, the foundation was completely rotten. He pointed to a graph showing their credit utilization over the past 5 years. He explained that truly wealthy people use credit as a tool to leverage their assets, but the Davenports were using it as a life support system. They were maxing out high-interest loans just to pay the minimum balances on other loans. It was a classic shell game. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes scanning the endless rows of red numbers. I asked him about the Hamptons estate that my sister had visited. My investigator pulled up the property deed and the subsequent bank records attached to it. He said the house was in a trust, but the trust had been completely emptied 3 years ago. They had taken out a massive reverse mortgage on the property. The bank was currently in the final stages of foreclosure. The Davenports were quite literally weeks away from being evicted from their own ancestral home. The pieces of the puzzle were finally starting to connect in my mind. This was why Julian was so incredibly desperate. This was why he had threatened to get me fired over a declined credit card. A man with real wealth would have simply laughed off the venue deposit issue and paid the $150,000 out of his own pocket. But Julian could not pay it, because Julian did not have it. He was completely broke. I asked the investigator to pull up Julian's personal bank accounts. The screen flashed and displayed a checking account balance that made me let out a soft laugh. Julian Davenport, the man who had verbally abused me and threatened to blackball me in the financial industry, had exactly $412 in his checking account. His credit cards were entirely maxed out, and he had multiple collections agencies actively hunting him down for unpaid luxury car leases. I sat back in my chair and let the sheer magnitude of the deception wash over me. My mother and my sister were completely blinded by the white privilege and the fake high society charm of the Davenport family. Aaliyah thought she was marrying a billionaire who was going to elevate her status and give her a life of endless luxury. She had lied to them about being the CEO of my company to make herself seem like an equal catch. But the Davenports were running the exact same scam on her. Julian had targeted Aaliyah because he saw her flashing my black card and bragging about her fake wealth management firm on social media. He thought she was his golden ticket out of bankruptcy. He thought he could marry into her supposed fortune and use her money to save his family estate from foreclosure. Both sides were entirely broke, and both sides were aggressively lying to each other to secure a financial rescue that did not actually exist. It was a beautiful disaster. They were two parasites trying to feed off each other, and I was the only actual host with any blood left to give. My investigator handed me a thick printed dossier containing all the hard evidence. It included the foreclosure notices, the unpaid tax liens, and the embarrassing credit scores of the entire Davenport family. He asked me if I wanted him to forward this information to the boutique law firm that had sent the cease and desist letter. I took the heavy folder from him and shook my head. I told him absolutely not. Handing this over to a lawyer would be too quiet and too private. They had tried to humiliate me in public. They had kicked me out into the freezing rain and told me I was not fit to stand in their presence. They had used their fake superiority to make me feel small. I was not going to handle this behind closed doors. I instructed my investigator to dig even deeper. I wanted to know exactly which vendors were hired for the wedding. I wanted the names of the caterers, the florists, and the event planners. I wanted to know every single person the Davenports owed money to in the state of New York. I was going to build an airtight cage around them, using their own financial ruin as the bars. I took the dossier and walked back to the private elevator. My heart was beating with a steady rhythmic precision. I was no longer just the angry sister or the discarded daughter. I was the architect of their downfall. I rode the elevator back up to my executive suite with a genuine smile on my face. Aaliyah and Julian wanted a massive, lavish wedding to celebrate their union of wealth and power. I decided right then and there that I was going to give them exactly what they wanted. I was going to make sure their wedding day was the most unforgettable event in high society history, but for all the wrong reasons. When I stepped out of the private elevator and walked back into my executive suite, the air in the room felt entirely different. The heavy mahogany desk that had been the site of my mother's violent tantrum just 24 hours ago now held something far more powerful than a signed contract. It held the absolute truth. I placed the thick printed dossier on the center of my desk and sat down in my leather chair. The city of Atlanta stretched out beyond the glass windows, completely unaware of the financial massacre I was about to orchestrate. I opened the manila folder and began to read through the documents line by line. My lead investigator had been incredibly thorough. The first document was a federal bankruptcy filing from exactly 3 years ago. The Davenport family had quietly filed for Chapter 11 protection, attempting to restructure massive debts accumulated from failed commercial real estate ventures. Julian's father had tried to play the market and lost everything. The old money fortune was gone. It had evaporated into thin air, leaving behind nothing but the hollow shell of a respected family name. I turned the page and found the legal notices regarding the Hamptons mansion. The beautiful oceanfront estate where I had stood freezing in the rain just a few days ago was not a symbol of their immense wealth. It was a ticking time bomb. The property had been heavily mortgaged, and the Davenports had defaulted on the payments over a year ago. The bank was currently executing a final notice of foreclosure. The mansion was scheduled to be auctioned off to the highest bidder in less than 2 months. They were hosting an engagement dinner in a house they did not even own anymore. I let out a long breath and shook my head at the sheer audacity of it all. Julian Davenport was not an heir to a fortune. He was a drowning man desperately reaching for a life raft. And he thought he had found that life raft in my sister. The psychological profile of their relationship became crystal clear to me as I sifted through the credit reports. Julian had targeted Aaliyah because she projected an image of limitless self-made wealth. She wore designer clothes, she drove a luxury car, and she carelessly swiped a Centurion black card for $50,000 shopping sprees. She had confidently looked him in the eye and told him she was the sole founder and chief executive officer of Apex Lifestyle and Wealth Management. Julian and his desperate parents had undoubtedly done a quick background search on my company. They saw the massive portfolio we managed, the downtown corporate tower, and the press releases detailing our continuous growth. They assumed Aaliyah was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. They were clinging to her because they believed her fake wealth would save their family from public ruin and absolute poverty. Julian was willing to marry a black woman he clearly did not respect, simply because he thought her bank account would pay off his father's crippling debts. His racist and condescending remarks to me on the phone were not the words of a powerful man defending his territory. They were the frantic barks of a cornered animal, terrified of losing his meal ticket. And the tragic irony of it all was that Aaliyah was playing the exact same game. She had absolutely nothing. Her entire existence was funded by my hard work. She was marrying Julian because she thought his old money pedigree would elevate her out of the working-class background she so desperately despised. She wanted the Hamptons mansion, the country club memberships, and the generational prestige that she thought came with the Davenport name. When I thought about my mother Brenda, the situation became even more pathetic. She had physically attacked me in my office, demanding $2 million to secure Aaliyah's place in a family that was currently dodging debt collectors. My mother was so blinded by her obsession with white wealth and high society validation that she never once thought to verify if the Davenports actually had any money. She was ready to steal from her own flesh and blood to buy a ticket onto a sinking ship. She thought she was securing a royal dynasty for her golden child, but she was actually pushing her right off a financial cliff. It was a perfect, flawless circle of deception. Aaliyah and Julian were two gold diggers aggressively mining each other, only to discover that both of their caves were completely empty. They were both lying, they were both broke, and they were both utterly dependent on my money to keep the charade alive. I closed the heavy dossier and rested my hands flat against the cool leather surface of the folder. I was holding the nuclear launch codes to both of their lives. With one single phone call, I could leak the Davenport bankruptcy to the New York socialite blogs. With one simple email, I could send Aaliyah's true financial standing to Julian's parents. The illusion would shatter instantly, and they would turn on each other like starved wolves. But doing that would be far too easy. It would allow them to retreat into the shadows and play the victims. My mother would undoubtedly find a way to blame me, claiming I maliciously destroyed my sister's happiness out of spite. Julian's family would simply pack up and flee to another state before the bank locked the doors of the Hamptons estate. No, I needed a stage. I needed an audience. I needed to construct a scenario where they were forced to confront their lies under the brightest lights possible. They had treated me like I was an uneducated peasant who did not know how to behave in their exclusive world. They had told me to go back to my car because my presence was an embarrassment. I was going to make sure they remembered my presence for the rest of their miserable lives. I picked up my phone and dialed the number for my personal real estate broker. The phone rang 3 times before she answered with her usual cheerful greeting. I did not bother with small talk. I asked her to immediately pull the ownership records and contact information for the commercial holding company that owned the glass pavilion in upstate New York. She sounded surprised by the sudden request, but promised to have the information within the hour. I told her to prepare for a rapid acquisition. I did not just want to book the venue for a night. I wanted to buy the entire property. I was going to take control of the very ground they planned to stand on. The trap was no longer just set. The walls were being built, and soon there would be absolutely no way out for the golden child or her fake billionaire fiancé. Exactly 3 days after my real estate broker began quietly purchasing the glass pavilion, an ornate envelope arrived at my office. It was a formal invitation printed on heavy cardstock. My mother had apparently convinced the Davenport family to fly down to Atlanta for a highly exclusive dinner at Le Baccarat, a 3-Michelin-star restaurant downtown. The handwritten note inside from my mother claimed that tempers had flared and they wanted to extend an olive branch. She wrote that family was the most important thing and that Julian's parents wanted to officially welcome me into the fold over a beautiful meal. I knew exactly what it was. It was not a reconciliation. It was an ambush. Desperate people do not apologize. They regroup and attack from a different angle. I wore a bespoke charcoal suit that radiated quiet authority and arrived at the restaurant exactly on time. The maitre d' escorted me to a private dining room tucked away in the back of the establishment. The room was bathed in dim golden light and smelled of expensive truffles and old wine. Sitting around the grand mahogany table were my mother Brenda, my sister Aaliyah Julian, and his parents Charles and Victoria Davenport. But they were not alone. Sitting at the far end of the table with a sleek leather briefcase resting next to his chair was a man in a sharp gray suit. I recognized him immediately. He was a partner at a mid-level corporate law firm in the city. The olive branch was actually a legal threat wrapped in a linen napkin. I took the empty seat across from Julian and his father. No one offered a genuine smile. The tension in the room was so thick, it felt like trying to breathe underwater. My mother was the first to speak. She leaned forward and put on her best maternal performance. Her voice was dripping with fake sympathy. She told me she was so proud of me for showing up and being the bigger person. She said she knew the last few days had been stressful for everyone, but tonight was about healing our broken bonds. I did not respond. I simply picked up the crystal glass in front of me and took a sip of sparkling water. My silence made them incredibly uncomfortable. Charles Davenport cleared his throat and adjusted his silk tie. He tried to use his imposing presence to intimidate me. He spoke with the slow, deliberate cadence of a man who was used to giving orders to his inferiors. He said, "Sienna, we are all reasonable people here. My son loves your sister very much, and we want to ensure that their marriage starts on a solid foundation." He looked down his nose at me and continued saying that the current structure of Apex Lifestyle and Wealth Management was creating unnecessary friction. He claimed that having an employee control the corporate credit accounts was highly unprofessional and deeply insulting to Aaliyah's position as the founder. I looked at Aaliyah. She was staring at her empty plate, refusing to make eye contact with me. She had actually managed to keep the lie going. Julian's parents still firmly believed she owned my empire. Victoria Davenport chimed in, her voice laced with the kind of passive-aggressive venom native to wealthy socialites. She said, "We understand that you have worked very hard in your administrative role, Sienna. But family businesses can be complicated. We simply cannot have these little emotional outbursts threatening the financial stability of the wedding." She offered a tight-lipped smile and added that it was time to put the company back into the hands of its rightful owner so we can all move forward as one big, happy family. The man in the gray suit. The lawyer finally made his move. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, sliding them across the table toward me. He placed a heavy gold pen right on top of the signature page. He introduced himself and explained that this was a standard transfer of corporate governance. He said it would officially relinquish my financial oversight and transfer full signatory rights to Aaliyah. He used big, intimidating legal words, hoping to confuse me into submission. I watched my mother lean back in her chair with a look of deep sorrow that she had perfected over decades. She began to weave a narrative of my supposed instability. She told the Davenports that I had always been a difficult child who struggled with jealousy. She said I had an unnatural obsession with controlling the family finances because I felt inadequate next to Aaliyah's natural grace and beauty. It was a masterclass in gaslighting. She was actively rewriting our entire history right in front of me, trying to convince Julian's parents that I was a mentally fragile employee who had delusionally convinced herself she was the boss. The lawyer chimed in right on cue. He steepled his fingers and used a soft, patronizing tone. He told me that courts do not look favorably upon rogue administrators who hold company assets hostage due to personal family grievances. He said, if this went to trial, the legal fees alone would bankrupt me. He suggested that signing the papers was the only way to protect myself from a brutal public humiliation. My mother reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. She squeezed my fingers tightly and looked at me with pleading eyes. She told me to just sign the papers so we could stop fighting. She whispered that if I loved her, I would do this one small thing for my sister. She promised that Aaliyah would keep me on the payroll and take good care of me. It was a brilliantly orchestrated psychological attack. They were using the lavish setting, the imposing white privilege of the Davenports, the legal jargon of the attorney, and the emotional manipulation of my mother to corner me. They wanted me to feel so small and so out of place that I would sign away my life just to escape the pressure. I looked down at the documents. I looked at the gold pen. And then I looked at the waiter who had just entered the room carrying our appetizers. I politely asked the waiter to place the seared scallops in front of me and thanked him. I picked up my silver fork and knife, completely ignoring the legal papers. The entire table watched in stunned silence as I calmly cut a piece of my appetizer and took a bite. I chewed slowly, savoring the rich flavor. The contrast between their frantic, aggressive energy and my total stillness was driving them insane. Aaliyah finally cracked. She slammed her hands on the table, her designer bracelets clinking loudly against the wood. She shrieked at me to just sign the stupid papers so they could enjoy their night. She said I was ruining everything just like I always did. I looked at the designer bracelets on her wrist. I knew exactly which account had paid for them. I knew the exact date the transaction posted. I looked at the tailored suit Julian was wearing and wondered which maxed-out credit card he had used to buy it. They were all sitting in a 3-Michelin-star restaurant trying to project an aura of invincible wealth while internally suffocating from the weight of their own poverty. Charles Davenport turned red with anger. He slammed his fist lightly on the table and demanded to know what I was doing. He said they were trying to conduct serious family business, and I was treating it like a joke. I wiped the corners of my mouth with my linen napkin and finally looked him dead in the eye. My voice was softer than his, but it carried the chilling weight of absolute certainty. I told him I was eating my dinner. I told him I did not review legal documents outside of my office, and I certainly did not sign corporate transfers between courses. Julian sneered and leaned across the table. He told me I was playing a very dangerous game. He said his family lawyer was sitting right there, and they could easily file an injunction by tomorrow morning to freeze all my personal accounts. He said I was going to lose everything if I did not pick up that pen. I held his gaze without blinking. I did not let a single ounce of emotion show on my face. I was staring at a man whose childhood home was about to be auctioned off to pay his father's gambling debts. I was looking at a man whose checking account could not cover the cost of the meal we were currently eating. The irony of him threatening to freeze my accounts was so delicious, it tasted better than the scallops. I set my fork down and rested my hands on the table. I told them I heard every single word they said. I told them I understood exactly what they wanted from me and how important this wedding was to the integration of our two families. I let my gaze drift over to my sister, who was visibly shaking in her chair. I knew they thought they had won. They thought my calm demeanor was a sign of resignation. They thought they had successfully broken the stubborn mule. But they had no idea that I was simply enjoying the view before I detonated the bomb. The silence in the private dining room was absolute. The waiter returned to clear my appetizer plate and set down the main course. It was a perfectly cooked, dry-aged ribeye steak. The aroma filled the space between us, but nobody else at the table seemed to have any appetite left. They were all staring at me, waiting for my response to Julian's ridiculous threat. Charles Davenport was breathing heavily through his nose, his face still flushed with anger. Victoria was gripping her wineglass so tightly I thought the crystal might shatter in her hand. My mother was looking at me with a mixture of terror and pleading, while Aaliyah just looked venomous. The lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his seat, realizing that his intimidation tactics had completely bounced off me. I picked up my steak knife and made a precise cut. I chewed the meat slowly, maintaining eye contact with Julian. His arrogant facade was starting to crack. Underneath all that bluster, he was a terrified little boy whose inheritance was already gone. I swallowed my bite and finally broke the silence. I told Julian that freezing my accounts would certainly be a bold move. I said it would definitely make things difficult for everyone involved, especially with the wedding coming up so quickly. I looked over at my mother and sighed heavily, playing right into the emotional narrative she had constructed. I told her that she was right. I said I was tired of fighting. I told them that building a wealth management firm from the ground up had taken a massive toll on my mental health, and maybe I was holding on too tightly to things that did not really matter. The shift in the room was immediate and palpable. The heavy tension suddenly evaporated. Charles Davenport relaxed his shoulders and leaned back in his chair, letting out a long breath of relief. Victoria offered a genuine smile for the first time all evening. My mother brought her hands to her chest and closed her eyes, murmuring a quick prayer of thanks. Aaliyah sat up straighter, a smug look of triumph washing over her face. She actually thought she had won. She thought her fake old money fiancé had scared me into surrendering my entire life's work. The lawyer immediately slid the documents closer to me and uncapped the heavy gold pen. He said, "That is a very mature decision, Sienna." He told me to just sign on the dotted lines and we could have this whole misunderstanding filed away by tomorrow morning. I reached out and picked up the pen. I held the cold metal between my fingers and let it hover over the thick cream paper. Aaliyah was practically vibrating with excitement. Julian crossed his arms and looked at me with an expression of pure condescension. He told me I was making the smart choice for my future. But I did not put the pen to the paper. Instead, I set the pen down gently next to my water glass. I pushed the documents back across the table toward the lawyer. I told them I would sign everything. I said I would transfer full signatory rights and corporate governance of Apex Lifestyle and Wealth Management over to Aaliyah just like they wanted. But I told them I was not going to sign it in the back room of a restaurant, like some kind of shady back alley deal. I looked directly at Charles Davenport and spoke with the utmost respect. I said, "Mr. Davenport, you mentioned earlier that we need to start this marriage on a solid foundation. You said we need to move forward as one big happy family and integrate our lives transparently. I completely agree with you." I told them that signing these papers in secret would not send the right message to the high society circles they operated in. I said if I am stepping down and handing the reins over to my sister, we need to make it a formal and celebrated event. I proposed that we do the official signing ceremony at the massive pre-wedding party scheduled for this weekend at the Glass Pavilion. I said I wanted to stand up on the stage in front of all their wealthy friends and extended family to publicly endorse Aaliyah. I told them I wanted to hand her the company in front of hundreds of witnesses to prove my absolute goodwill and loyalty to the Davenport family. The table went completely silent again, but this time it was not out of anger. It was out of shock and overwhelming greed. They were so blinded by their own desires that they could not see the massive trap I had just laid at their feet. Julian looked at his father seeking approval. Charles Davenport was practically glowing. The idea of a public corporate handover in front of all his wealthy peers stroked his massive ego perfectly. It would make the Davenport family look like they had just acquired a massive asset. He smiled broadly and nodded his head. He said, "That is a brilliant idea, Sienna." He said it shows incredible class, and it will be a wonderful surprise for our guests. Victoria agreed enthusiastically. She said it would be the perfect way to silence any rumors about family friction. My mother was crying tears of joy, reaching across the table to try and hold my hand again, but I smoothly pulled my hand away to pick up my wine glass. Aaliyah was glowing. She looked at me with a smug, satisfied grin. She told me she always knew I would eventually do the right thing for the family. The lawyer seemed slightly confused by the delay, but he was not getting paid to argue with his clients when they were happy. He packed the documents back into his leather briefcase and promised to bring them to the glass pavilion on the night of the party. The rest of the dinner was a sickening display of fake affection. They ordered expensive champagne to celebrate. They laughed and joked and talked about the lavish wedding details. Julian and his father ordered the most expensive bottles of wine on the menu, completely unaware that my corporate card was the only thing keeping them from washing dishes in the kitchen. My mother kept praising my maturity. Aaliyah talked endlessly about the changes she was going to make to my company once she was officially the boss. She talked about firing my executive assistant and redecorating my corner office with pink furniture. I sat there quietly eating my steak and sipping my water. I nodded when it was appropriate and offered polite smiles. I let them bathe in their false victory. They thought they had tamed the black sheep. They thought they had used their power and influence to steal my empire without firing a single shot. They had no idea that I had just invited them all to their own execution. The papers would be there, the lawyer would be there, the wealthy guests would be there, and most importantly, the absolute truth would be there. When the dessert plates were finally cleared, I placed my linen napkin gently on the table and politely excused myself. I told them I had a lot of preparations to make for the big night and I needed to get back to the office to finalize some very important paperwork. And for the first time that entire evening, I was telling the absolute truth. I walked out of the dim, private dining room and into the cool night air, leaving them completely trapped in a cage they had built themselves. I handed the valet my ticket and waited for my car on the quiet street corner. The cool night air felt incredible against my skin. I had just walked out of a room filled with the most toxic people in my life, but I did not feel drained. I felt energized. They thought they had outsmarted me. They thought they had used their combined social weight to crush my spirit and steal my company. I watched the valet pull my sleek black car up to the curb. I tipped him generously and slid into the driver's seat. As I drove through the neon-lit streets of downtown Atlanta, my mind was not dwelling on their insults. My mind was entirely focused on the mechanics of a corporate acquisition. The next morning, my phone buzzed on my nightstand at exactly 6 a.m. It was my real estate broker. Her voice sounded slightly breathless. She told me she had spent the entire night tracking down the primary shareholders of the holding company that owned the glass pavilion. She said they were completely shocked by the unsolicited offer, but they were willing to sell. There was just one catch. They knew I wanted the property immediately, so they demanded a massive premium on the market value, and they required the entire transaction to be completed in pure cash by Friday afternoon. They assumed those terms would scare me away or stall the process. I did not even hesitate. I sat up in bed and told my broker to draw up the contracts immediately. I told her I would have the cash wired to the escrow account before noon. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. My broker had worked with wealthy clients before, but very few people could liquidate millions of dollars in cash overnight without batting an eye. She told me she would get it done and hung up. I walked into my master bathroom and turned on the shower. The hot water washed over me as I mentally calculated which short-term corporate bonds I needed to liquidate to free up the capital. For the last decade, my mother had called me a machine. She said I cared more about spreadsheets and profit margins than I did about human connection. She used my success as a weapon against me, claiming it made me cold and unlovable. But standing there in the steam, I realized that my cold and calculating nature was the exact thing that was going to protect me. Aaliyah and Julian were driven by desperate emotion and fake prestige. I was driven by raw, undeniable capital. By Wednesday afternoon, the funds were completely secured. I sat in my corner office and met with my lead investigator and the head of my legal team. The visual aids for the pre-wedding party needed to be flawless. I did not want to stand on a stage and argue with them. I wanted the evidence to speak so loudly that no one could possibly deny it. My investigator handed me a sleek silver USB flash drive. He said the drive contained high-resolution scans of every single damning document we had uncovered. It held the Davenport bankruptcy filings, the foreclosure notices for the Hamptons estate, the collection letters for Julian's unpaid car leases, and the true unedited corporate registration showing me as the sole owner of Apex. I held the small flash drive in the palm of my hand. It weighed almost nothing, but it contained enough destructive power to obliterate 2 entire families. My lawyer asked if I wanted him to draft an actual handover document just to play along with their expectations at the party. I told him yes. I wanted the fake contract to look as official and imposing as possible so they would drop their guard completely right before I plugged the flash drive into the projector. On Thursday afternoon, I received the call from my broker. The wire transfer had cleared, and the final signatures were verified. The deed was officially registered under one of my private holding companies. I was now the sole owner of the glass pavilion. I owned the transparent walls, the sweeping grand staircases, the crystal chandeliers, and the private lake. I did not just buy a venue. I bought the absolute authority to decide who was allowed to stand inside of it. Early Friday morning, before the chaos of the weekend could begin, I took a private flight from Atlanta to New York. I rented a car and drove directly to the glass pavilion. The sheer scale of the building was breathtaking in person. The morning sun bounced off the massive glass panels reflecting the surrounding forest. I parked near the front entrance and walked through the grand double doors. The lobby was buzzing with caterers, florists, and event staff frantically setting up for the Davenport pre-wedding party. A man in a sharp suit holding a clipboard rushed over to me. He looked stressed and overworked. He told me the venue was closed for a private high-profile event and asked me to leave. I recognized his face from Aaliyah's panicked description. He was the event director. He was the man who had declined her black card. I reached into my purse and pulled out my new business card along with a single sheet of paper confirming the change in ownership. I handed them to him and politely introduced myself as his new employer. The man read the paper and the color completely drained from his face. He started to stammer an apology, but I held up my hand to stop him. I smiled and told him there was no need to apologize. I praised him for running a tight ship and doing his job well. I asked him how the preparations for the Davenport event were going. He swallowed hard and told me it was a nightmare. He said the bride was throwing tantrums over the floral arrangements, and the groom's father kept demanding premium upgrades without wanting to pay the deposits. I nodded slowly, absorbing the pathetic reality of their behavior. They were treating my staff like garbage while secretly drowning in debt. I told the event director to give them absolutely everything they asked for. I instructed him to upgrade the champagne to the most expensive vintage in the cellar to double the floral budget and to accommodate every single ridiculous demand Aaliyah made. He looked confused and pointed out that their credit card had already been declined once. I told him not to worry about the bill because the owner was covering it. I said I wanted them to feel like absolute royalty tonight. Then I gave him my final and most important instruction. I told him to set up the largest high-definition projector screen they had right in the center of the main ballroom stage. He asked what the screen was for. I told him the bride's family was planning a very special presentation to honor the groom. I told him to make sure the audio and visual connections were flawless. He nodded eagerly, wanting to please his new boss. I left the venue and checked into a luxury hotel nearby. The trap was fully assembled. The stage was literally mine. I spent the evening alone in my suite preparing my mind for what was to come. I walked into the massive walk-in closet and looked at the dress I had chosen for the party. I was not going to wear a subdued pastel color to blend into the background. I was not going to look like a humble employee. I had selected a stunning floor-length gown in a deep crimson red. It was the color of absolute power. It was the color of a predator stepping into a room full of unsuspecting prey. I stood in front of the full-length mirror and looked at my own reflection. I was no longer the discarded daughter freezing in the rain. I was the owner of the battlefield, and the war was about to begin. The drive to the glass pavilion took only 15 minutes, but every second felt electric. When my driver pulled up to the grand entrance, the entire venue was glowing against the dark night sky. Valet attendants were rushing to park a long line of luxury European cars. I stepped out of the back seat, and the cool evening breeze caught the train of my crimson-red gown. I walked up the sweeping stone stairs and through the massive glass doors. The inside was spectacular. My event director had followed my orders perfectly. Thousands of white roses cascaded from the crystal chandeliers, and waitstaff in crisp tuxedos floated through the crowd carrying trays of the most expensive vintage champagne. Hundreds of New York's supposed elite were mingling and laughing, entirely oblivious to the fact that they were standing on my property. I had barely taken 10 steps into the main ballroom before a hand grabbed my arm tightly. It was my mother. She did not greet me. Her fingers dug into my skin as she yanked me toward a secluded alcove near the coat check. Aaliyah was waiting there holding a glass of champagne and glaring at me. My sister looked me up and down, her eyes lingering on the deep red silk of my dress. She scoffed and asked what the hell I was wearing. She told me I looked like a desperate attention seeker, and that wearing bright red to her pre-wedding event was a pathetic attempt to outshine the bride. My mother quickly chimed in. She lowered her voice to a harsh whisper and told me I needed to keep my mouth shut tonight. She said I was only here to play a specific role. She instructed me to smile for the cameras, sign the documents when called upon, and then quietly slip out the back door before the dancing started, so my working-class energy would not ruin the elegant atmosphere. Before I could even respond, Charles and Victoria Davenport strolled into the alcove. They were holding their drinks and looking exceptionally smug. Victoria gave my red dress a patronizing look and sighed. She said she supposed they could not expect me to understand the subtle nuances of high society dress codes. Charles laughed a deep, arrogant chuckle. He took a sip of his scotch and looked at me like I was a newly purchased piece of farm equipment. He told me that my people were certainly known for being loud and colorful. He used that specific condescending tone that wealthy white men use when they are trying to put a successful black woman back in her place. He said it was very admirable how I hustled to help Aaliyah with her little administrative tasks at the company. He said it showed that I had a good, strong work ethic despite my urban background. But he added, it was time for the adults to take the wheel now. He said tonight was about elevating Aaliyah to the Davenport standard and ensuring the family business was managed with the proper pedigree. They were standing inside a building that I bought with cash, drinking champagne that I paid for and insulting my heritage, while their own family estate was currently sitting on a bank auction block waiting for the highest bidder. The irony was so sharp it could have cut glass. I did not raise my voice. I did not let my smile falter. I looked directly into Charles Davenport's eyes and told him I completely agreed. I said tonight was absolutely about revealing true pedigrees. I told Victoria I was very excited for the entire crowd to see exactly what the Davenport standard truly looked like. They smiled warmly, thinking I had fully submitted to their authority. My mother let out a loud sigh of relief and patted my shoulder, telling me to go wait near the back of the room until I was called to the stage. I walked away from their toxic little circle and positioned myself near the center aisle. The ballroom was packed with over 300 guests. At the very front of the room was a massive elevated stage. Right behind the podium was the huge high-definition projector screen I had requested earlier that morning. Currently, it was just displaying a tasteful illuminated monogram of Julian and Ayalaya's initials. The lights in the ballroom began to dim and a soft spotlight illuminated the stage. The crowd quieted down as Julian stepped up to the microphone. He was wearing a tailored tuxedo that he definitely could not afford. He tapped the microphone and smiled, flashing his perfect teeth at the audience. Julian began his speech with a long, rambling monologue about the importance of legacy. He talked about the deep historic roots of the Davenport family and how thrilled he was to merge his wealthy bloodline with the incredible brilliance of his beautiful bride. The crowd clapped politely. My sister was standing near the front row, dabbing fake tears from her eyes. Julian then raised his hand to quiet the room. He said, "Tonight is not just about love, but it is also about the future of our family enterprise." He proudly announced to the room that Aaliyah was the brilliant founder and chief executive officer of Apex Lifestyle and Wealth Management. A murmur of impressed whispers rippled through the wealthy crowd. Julian smiled greedily and continued. He said, "Managing such a massive empire is a heavy burden, and tonight, Aaliyah's older sister Sienna is going to officially transfer all her administrative and corporate oversight back to the rightful owner." Julian held up the thick stack of legal documents. The lawyer from the restaurant was standing right next to the stage, holding the heavy gold pen. Julian looked out into the sea of faces, and his eyes locked onto my crimson dress. His voice boomed through the speakers with absolute unearned authority. He told me to please come up to the stage. He told the crowd this was a beautiful moment of family unity. He told me to come up and sign the papers to show everyone that I understood my place and that I supported this incredible union. The spotlight swung violently away from Julian and landed directly on me. 300 heads turned simultaneously to stare at the black woman in the bright red dress. The silence in the room was deafening. I could feel my mother's anxious eyes burning into the back of my head. I could feel Victoria's condescending sneer from across the room. They all expected me to walk up those steps, keep my head bowed down in submission, and sign away my life savings to protect their fake reality. I took a slow, deep breath. I squared my shoulders and began to walk down the center aisle. The click of my heels echoed loudly against the marble floor. I did not look like a defeated employee. I looked like the owner of the building. I walked up the short flight of stairs and stepped onto the stage. Julian held out the gold pen to me with a triumphant smirk on his face. The tension in the room was pulled so tight it felt like the walls were going to crack. The lion's den was fully assembled, but they had no idea they had just locked the doors with the hunter inside. The spotlight was still blinding, but my vision was perfectly clear. I stepped up to the podium and looked out over the sea of faces. Julian was still holding the gold pen out to me. His smug smile stretched wide across his face. The lawyer tapped the thick stack of papers resting on the podium, indicating exactly where I needed to sign my name. My mother was standing near the front row, clutching her hands together in a silent prayer of victory. Aaliyah was right beside her, trying to look like a graceful executive accepting her rightful inheritance. I did not reach for the pen. Instead, I reached for the microphone resting on the podium stand. I pulled it from its clip, and a slight feedback echoed through the massive ballroom. The crowd fell completely silent. They were waiting for me to give a tearful speech about family loyalty. They were waiting for me to bow down and surrender my empire. I looked directly at Julian and smiled. My voice was calm and steady as it carried through the high-quality speakers. I said, "Julian, you are absolutely right about one thing. Tonight is about the future of this family enterprise, and it is crucial that everyone here understands exactly who is running it." Julian nodded. His chest puffed out with pride. He thought I was feeding right into his narrative, but then I reached into the small clutch purse I was holding. I bypassed the pen Julian was offering and pulled out the sleek silver flash drive. The event director was standing right off to the side of the stage next to the laptop that controlled the massive projector screen behind us. I walked past Julian, leaving him holding his pen in the empty air, and handed the drive to the director. I told him to open the first file. He plugged the drive in and clicked his mouse. The tasteful monogram of their initials instantly vanished from the giant screen. It was replaced by a massive high-definition scan of a state corporate registry document. The text was huge and impossible to miss. I walked back to the center of the stage holding the microphone. I turned to look at the screen and then turned back to the audience. I said, "Ladies and gentlemen, Julian was kind enough to introduce my sister as the brilliant founder and chief executive officer of Apex Lifestyle and Wealth Management." I gestured toward the screen. I said, "But as you can see from the official state licensing board, my sister Aaliyah does not own a single share of stock in Apex. She is not the founder. She is not the CEO. In fact, she is not even officially on the payroll." A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom of 300 wealthy guests. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. I pointed at the large, bold text at the bottom of the document on the screen. I said, "My name is Sienna. I am the sole owner and founder of Apex. I built the firm from the ground up while my sister spent her days taking selfies in designer clothes that I purchased for her." Julian stood completely frozen. The gold pen slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the wooden stage. He looked at the screen, and then he looked at Aaliyah. His face was completely drained of blood. The arrogant smirk had been wiped away, leaving behind a look of absolute horror. Aaliyah let out a high-pitched shriek. She lunged forward from the front row, grabbing the edge of the stage. She screamed at the event director to turn off the projector. She yelled that the documents were fake and that I was an insane, jealous sister trying to ruin her wedding. Her face was red and tears were streaming down her perfect makeup. I did not raise my voice, but my words cut through her screaming like a knife. I said, "Ah, Aaliyah, there is no need to shout. These are public records." I pressed a button on the remote clicker the event director had handed me, and the screen transitioned to the next slide. It was a detailed spreadsheet of credit card statements and wire transfers. The numbers were staggering. I said, "For the last 5 years, I have fully funded my sister's luxurious lifestyle. The penthouse she lives in, the car. She drives the $5,000 engagement dress she is wearing right now. It was all paid for by me. I even gave our mother a Centurion black card to help with groceries, and instead they used it to fund this fake high society charade." I looked down at Charles and Victoria Davenport. They were standing in the front row, looking like they had just been struck by lightning. Victoria's mouth was slightly open, and her hands were trembling. Charles looked as if he was struggling to breathe. The wealthy black family they thought they were merging with was a complete illusion. The massive fortune they thought was going to save their sinking ship belonged entirely to the woman they had just spent the evening insulting. I spoke directly to them. I said, "Mr. and Mrs. Davenport, you told me earlier that it was time for the adults to take the wheel. You said my urban background was loud and colorful, but that you needed someone with the proper pedigree to handle the family business." I tilted my head and looked at them with pure pity. I said, "The truth is, you have been worshipping an unemployed fraud. Aaliyah has absolutely nothing to offer your son except the clothes on her back, and even those technically belong to me." The crowd began to murmur loudly. The hushed whispers of the elite guests filled the room like a swarm of bees. They were looking at Aaliyah and Julian with a mixture of shock and extreme judgment. Julian finally snapped out of his trance. He turned on Aaliyah, his eyes wide with panic and rage. He stepped away from the podium and his voice cracked as he yelled without the microphone. He looked at my sister and demanded to know if this was true. He asked her if she had lied to him about owning the company. Aaliyah was sobbing hysterically. She tried to reach for Julian's hand, but he aggressively pulled away from her. She begged him to listen to her, saying she only did it because she loved him and wanted to fit into his world. She confessed everything in front of 300 people without even realizing it. She cried out that the money did not matter and that their love was real. Julian backed away from her as if she were carrying a disease. The gold mine he thought he was digging had just collapsed, burying him alive. He realized he was about to marry a woman with zero assets and zero income. The absolute panic in his eyes was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. He had built his entire future on my bank account, and I had just pulled the rug out from under him in the most public way possible. My mother was standing off to the side, holding her hands over her face, weeping loudly. She had pushed her golden child into the arms of high society, and in the process, she had completely destroyed her. They had tried to steal my life work using fake prestige and psychological warfare. They had brought a legal contract to a family dinner. But they had severely underestimated my willingness to burn their entire fake world to the ground. The first bomb had detonated flawlessly, and the golden child was officially exposed to the world. But the show was far from over. I still held the clicker in my hand, and Julian was about to learn that my sister was not the only fraud in the room. I pressed the button on the small black remote in my hand, and the screen behind me flickered one more time. The massive spreadsheet detailing my sister's endless shopping sprees and fake wealth disappeared. It was instantly replaced by a stark black and white legal document. The font was large and uncompromising. At the very top of the page, the seal of the United States Bankruptcy Court was displayed for every single person in the ballroom to see. Right below the seal was the name Charles Davenport, followed by a formal declaration of Chapter 11, Financial Ruin. The collective gasp from the crowd this time was much louder. The polite whispers of the wealthy elite instantly transformed into an aggressive wave of shocked murmurs. They were reading the dates on the filing, realizing that the prestigious Davenport family had been completely bankrupt for 3 years. People who had just been drinking champagne and toasting to the new couple were now setting their glasses down on the tables, looking around the room in absolute disbelief. I looked down at Julian, who was still standing near the edge of the stage. His face had gone from pale white to a sickly shade of gray. He looked like a man who had just been shoved out of an airplane without a parachute. His eyes were locked onto the screen, reading the intimate details of his father's massive failed real estate investments and the total liquidation of their generational trust fund being broadcast to his entire social circle. I brought the microphone back to my mouth. My voice echoed across the massive room, cutting through the rising noise of the crowd. I said, "You spent the last year bragging to everyone that you were marrying into Hampton's royalty. You looked down on me because I actually worked for a living while you thought you had secured a billionaire heir who would elevate you into the highest tiers of society." I paused and pointed at the screen. I said, "But the man standing next to you has exactly $412 in his checking account." Aaliyah stopped crying for a fraction of a second. Her face contorted in absolute confusion. She wiped a streak of mascara from her cheek and stared at the bankruptcy filing. Her brain was struggling to process the information. She had sacrificed her relationship with me and humiliated herself to secure this marriage. She had built her entire future on the promise of the Davenport fortune. I clicked the remote again. The slide transitioned to a notice of default and foreclosure from a major national bank. The property address listed in bold letters was the exact Hamptons estate where they had hosted their exclusive engagement dinner just a few days ago. I looked directly at Charles and Victoria Davenport, who were now frozen in the front row. The wealthy friends they had invited were physically backing away from them as if poverty was contagious. I said, "Mr. and Mrs. Davenport, you tried to force me into signing my company over to my sister because you desperately needed a financial life raft. Your ancestral home is scheduled to be auctioned off to the highest bidder next month. You were completely relying on my sister to pay off your massive debts." I clicked the remote one final time. The screen split in half. On one side was Julian's credit report showing multiple maxed-out cards and collection notices for his unpaid luxury car leases. On the other side was Aaliyah's actual bank statement showing a balance of 0. I looked back and forth between the two of them on the stage. I said, "You two are a match made in heaven. You are two broke gold diggers who spent the entire year aggressively lying to each other." Julian, you thought Aaliyah was your golden ticket out of poverty. Aaliyah, you thought Julian was your ticket to high society. Neither of you has a single dime to your name. The sheer absolute finality of my words broke the spell holding the room together. The silence shattered completely, and the stage descended into absolute chaos. Aaliyah let out a scream that sounded like a wounded animal. She lunged at Julian, her hands curled into fists. She slammed her palms against his chest, screaming that he was a liar and a broke loser. She yelled that she had wasted her youth on a man who could not even afford the tuxedo he was wearing. She screamed that he had ruined her life and made a fool out of her in front of the entire city. She grabbed the lapels of his jacket and shook him violently, crying that she was supposed to be a billionaire wife. Julian did not back down. The illusion of his refined upper-class manners evaporated instantly. He shoved Aaliyah backwards so hard she almost tripped over the hem of her expensive engagement dress. He pointed his finger in her face and screamed right back at her. He called her a manipulative fraud. He yelled that she was nothing but a cheap imposter who used her sister's money to trap him. He said his family was humiliated because of her lies and that he would rather die than marry a penniless grifter. He mocked her working-class background, telling her she was going back to the streets where she belonged. They were standing in the middle of a stage surrounded by thousands of white roses screaming the most vile insults at each other. They were tearing each other apart right in front of the very people they had desperately tried to impress. The elite guests were pulling out their phones to record the spectacular meltdown of the fake empire. The high society wedding of the year had turned into a glorious public brawl between two desperate con artists. Security guards started moving toward the front of the room, unsure if they should intervene in a domestic dispute of this magnitude. Down in the front row, the damage was just as catastrophic. Charles Davenport was shouting at the event director to turn off the projector, but the director just stood there, refusing to help the man who had treated him like garbage all morning. Charles then tried to confront some of the guests who were laughing at him, telling them it was all a big misunderstanding and a clerical error. But no one was listening to him anymore. Victoria Davenport had buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably, as the women she used to play tennis with whispered cruelly behind her back, pointing at her cheap jewelry that everyone now realized was fake. And then there was my mother. Brenda stood frozen in the center of the madness. Her eyes darted from the screaming match on the stage to the foreclosure notices on the massive screen. The reality of the situation finally crashed down on her shoulders. She had alienated her successful daughter. She had physically attacked me in my office, and she had thrown away her only source of financial security, all to push Aaliyah into a family that was drowning in debt. She realized that not only was the dream of high society dead, but her own luxurious lifestyle was permanently over. She had bet everything on a losing hand. Her knees simply gave out. She let out a weak, breathless gasp and collapsed onto the marble floor. She lay there in her designer gown, weeping into her hands, completely ignored by the wealthy guests around her. Her golden child was too busy screaming on stage to even notice that her mother had fallen. The man my mother had worshipped as her future son-in-law was currently calling her daughter a scam artist for everyone to hear. I stood perfectly still behind the podium, watching the destruction unfold. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I had not forced them to lie. I had not forced them to be greedy. I simply turned on the lights and let them see the ugly truth they had built for themselves. The fake empire was completely leveled, and they were the ones who had provided the explosives. The chaos on the stage was deafening, but my attention was suddenly drawn downward. My mother had managed to pull herself up from the marble floor. Her expensive designer gown was wrinkled and stained with tears. Brenda dragged herself toward the steps of the stage, her hands shaking violently. She grabbed the edge of the podium right next to my feet. She looked up at me with a face completely broken by desperation and panic. She reached out and grabbed my wrist, her fingernails digging into my skin. She sobbed uncontrollably and begged me to stop this. She whispered that I had made my point and that I needed to fix this right now. She pleaded with me to write Julian's family a check to cover their debts so the wedding could proceed. She said we could not lose the Davenport connection and that our family honor would be ruined forever if I walked away. She actually wanted me to buy a bankrupt white family just so she could pretend to be part of high society. I looked down at the woman who had spent my entire life telling me I was not good enough. I looked at the mother who had stolen my college tuition to buy a car for my sister. I looked at the mother who had tried to slap me in my own office just days ago. I did not feel anger anymore. I only felt a cold, absolute indifference. I calmly raised my arm and swatted her hand away from my wrist. I did it with the exact same dismissive energy she had used against me my entire life. She gasped and stumbled backward, almost falling down the steps. I pulled the microphone close to my mouth for the final time. My voice echoed through the ballroom, instantly commanding the attention of every single person in the room, including the screaming couple on the stage. I said there is one final piece of corporate business we need to address tonight. Julian and Aaliyah stopped yelling at each other and turned to look at me. Charles and Victoria Davenport stared up at the stage, their eyes wide with fear, wondering what else I could possibly take from them. I said my sister and the Davenport family thought they could use this beautiful venue to celebrate their fake empire. They thought they could humiliate me and force me to sign away my company right here in this room. I looked directly at Julian and smiled. I said, "But you all made one fatal miscalculation. You assumed I was just a guest here tonight." I gestured to the massive glass walls and the crystal chandeliers above us. I said, as of yesterday morning, Apex Lifestyle and Wealth Management officially acquired this entire estate. The transaction was completed in pure cash. I am not a guest at the Glass Pavilion. I am the owner of the Glass Pavilion. The event director standing off to the side of the stage nodded vigorously, confirming my statement to the crowd. The absolute shock on Aaliyah's face was paralyzing. Julian's jaw literally dropped. They were standing on a stage that belonged to me inside a building that belonged to me, drinking champagne that belonged to me. I turned to the event director and the team of large security guards who had gathered near the front row. I pointed directly at Julian, Aaliyah, Charles, Victoria, and my mother. I told the guards that these 5 individuals were no longer welcome on my property. I ordered security to escort the fraudulent families out the back door and off the premises immediately. The guards did not hesitate. They moved in instantly. 2 guards grabbed Julian by the arms while he tried to aggressively pull away. Another guard gently but firmly took my mother by the elbow. Leah started screaming again, thrashing wildly, as a female security officer escorted her down the stage steps. Charles Davenport tried to threaten the guards with legal action, but his words were completely hollow now, and no one cared. I spoke into the microphone one last time, addressing the hundreds of wealthy guests who were watching the spectacular eviction. I told them the main entertainment for the evening was officially over, but the bar was fully funded, and they were welcome to stay and enjoy the rest of the champagne on my tab. The crowd actually started to clap. A wave of applause rippled through the room as the fake royalty was dragged out the service exit. I placed the microphone down on the podium. I did not look back at my mother or my sister. I walked down the steps of the stage, and the sea of elite guests physically parted to let me through. They looked at me with a mixture of absolute fear and profound respect. The click of my heels echoed against the marble floor as I walked out the main double doors and into the cool night air. The valet had my car waiting right at the front. I slipped into the quiet luxury of the leather seat and let out a deep breath. The sky above New York was clear and filled with stars. My phone was already buzzing with frantic text messages from extended family members, but I simply powered the device off. The dead weight I had been carrying for 32 years was finally gone. As African American women, we are so often conditioned to be the mules of the world. We are taught from a young age that our worth is measured by how much we can sacrifice for our families. We are expected to shrink ourselves, to swallow our pride, and to quietly fund the dreams of the people around us, even when they treat us like we are completely invisible. We are told that family is everything, even when that family is actively draining the life out of us. But tonight, I broke that cycle forever. I learned that true power does not come from earning the approval of toxic people. It comes from defining your own worth and refusing to be a stepping stone for anyone else's fake reality. You do not owe your success to people who only love you when your bank account is open. Family is supposed to be a safe harbor, not a parasite that feeds on your hard work. If you have ever had to make the incredibly painful decision to walk away from toxic family members who tried to use you, please know that you are not alone. The guilt they try to put on you is just a manipulation tactic to keep you under their control. You are allowed to protect your peace. You are allowed to protect your wealth. And you are absolutely allowed to lock the door behind you. Thank you so much for listening to my story. If you found strength in this journey, please leave a comment below and share your own experiences of breaking free from toxic family dynamics. Hit the like button and make sure to subscribe to the channel so we can continue to build a community of strong, independent people who refuse to be taken advantage of. Remember, your life is your own empire, so build it, protect it, and never apologize for protecting your crown. I will see you all in the next video.